Every face in town dropped their gaze when Eleanor entered a room, their whispers cutting deeper than the mountain lion's claws ever had. Then a weathered cowboy stepped into her classroom, his storm-gray eyes locked on her scars with an intensity that stole her breath, not with pity, but with something she hadn't felt in years: recognition. Before we continue, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, like the video, and comment where in the world you're watching from. Let's go. The September wind carried the scent of dying grass across Willow Creek, whipping through the wooden slats of the general store where Eleanor Reed stood frozen before the newly installed mirror. Her fingers traced the jagged lines that ran from her left temple down across her cheek, 3 distinct marks that resembled claw marks, permanent reminders of the night that had changed everything. At 28, she had made peace with solitude. Her dreams of love and family had been buried beneath layers of whispers and averted gazes that followed her everywhere in this small Montana town. "Miss Reed," Mrs. Donovan called from behind the counter, her voice carrying that particular blend of pity and discomfort that Eleanor had grown accustomed to over the past 2 years. "Your order's ready." Eleanor pulled her shawl higher, partially covering the left side of her face, a habit she'd developed not for herself, but for the comfort of others who seemed unable to look at her without wincing. She collected her packages, nodding politely but avoiding further conversation. The less she spoke, the fewer opportunities people had to stare. Outside, the main street of Willow Creek bustled with afternoon activity. Children raced between wagons and horses, ranchers and farmers conducted business on boardwalks, and women gathered in clusters, their conversations pausing noticeably as Eleanor passed by. She kept her eyes forward, her spine straight, her steps measured and deliberate. 2 years had taught her how to move through spaces as if she were invisible, how to ignore the hushed comments that followed in her wake. "Poor thing," someone whispered. "Such a shame." "Used to be the prettiest girl in 3 counties, another replied. Eleanor pretended not to hear, though each word landed like a physical blow. Before the accident, she had been the school teacher, respected and admired. Now she tutored children in her small cabin at the edge of town, those whose parents valued education enough to overcome their discomfort at her appearance. The sound of hoofbeats drew her attention as a group of riders approached from the direction of the Blackwater Ranch. Among them rode a man she didn't recognize, tall and broad-shouldered, his face shadowed beneath a dusty brown Stetson. Unlike his companions, he didn't turn away when he noticed her. Instead, his gaze lingered, direct and unflinching. Eleanor clutched her packages tighter and quickened her pace. The last thing she needed was another stranger's morbid curiosity. Her cottage sat nestled against the edge of the pine forest, far enough from town to provide the solitude she craved. Inside, books lined the walls, her most faithful companions since the accident. She set down her purchases and moved to the small mirror above her wash basin, allowing herself to do what she rarely did, look directly at her scars without flinching. The mountain lion attack had left more than physical marks. It had divided her life into before and after, transforming her from Eleanor Reed, beloved teacher and eligible young woman, into an object of pity and discomfort, the scarred spinster who lived alone at the edge of town. A knock at her door startled her. Few people visited, and never without prior arrangement. For a moment she considered ignoring it, but years of ingrained politeness wouldn't allow it. Adjusting her shawl to cover her scars, she opened the door. The stranger from town stood on her porch, hat in hand. Up close, she could see he was older than she'd first thought, perhaps in his mid-30s, with sun-weathered skin and eyes the color of a summer storm. "Miss Reed?" His voice was deep, with a slight rasp that suggested he used it sparingly. "Yes?" She kept her scarred side turned away, a practiced movement. "My name is Matthew Callahan. I've purchased the old Wilson property." He gestured vaguely westward. I was told you might be willing to tutor my son." Eleanor's surprise must have shown on her face because he continued. "He's 12 and behind in his schooling. We've moved around a lot, and his education has suffered for it." She hesitated. A new student meant income she desperately needed, but it also meant facing another child's initial reaction to her scars, another parent who might change their mind once they truly saw her. "Perhaps you should come in, Mr. Callahan," she said finally, stepping back to allow him entry. He moved with the easy grace of a man accustomed to physical labor, taking in her modest home with an appraising glance. When she turned to face him fully, she braced herself for the familiar sequence, the widening eyes, the quick glance away, the carefully composed expression of sympathy. Instead, Matthew Callahan looked directly at her, his gaze steady and untroubled. "My son Daniel has a quick mind," he said, continuing as if her appearance was unremarkable. "But he struggles with reading. Our last tutor thought he might have a condition that makes letters appear jumbled." Eleanor found herself momentarily speechless. It had been so long since someone had spoken to her rather than around her, looked at her rather than through her. "I've worked with similar students," she managed. "There are techniques that can help." He nodded, seemingly satisfied. "What are your rates?" They discussed practical matters, scheduling, payment, materials, and with each passing minute, Eleanor felt an unfamiliar sensation growing in her chest. It took her a moment to recognize it as hope. As Matthew prepared to leave, he paused at the door. "Daniel and I will be by tomorrow afternoon if that suits you." "That would be fine," she replied, still waiting for the moment when his eyes would drift to her scars and cloud with pity. Instead, he settled his hat back on his head and said, "Thank you, Miss Reed. Education's important, especially out here. Most folks are too busy surviving to remember there's more to life than just making it through each day." After he left, Eleanor stood motionless, her hand pressed against her scarred cheek. For the first time in 2 years, she had been seen, truly seen, as more than the marks she bore. The feeling was as terrifying as it was exhilarating. The following afternoon, Eleanor arranged her small sitting room with unusual care. She set out her best pens and freshest paper, selected books of varying difficulty, and even placed a jar of wildflowers on the table, something she hadn't bothered with since before the accident. She told herself it was professional pride, nothing more. When the knock came, she smoothed her dress and touched her hair briefly before opening the door. Matthew Callahan stood there, one hand on the shoulder of a lanky boy with the same storm-gray eyes. "Miss Reed," Matthew nodded in greeting. "This is my son, Daniel." The boy looked up at her, his eyes widening as they fixed on her scars. Eleanor had expected this. Children were always the most honest in their reactions, but it still stung. "Hello, Daniel," she said gently. "I'm pleased to meet you." To her surprise, the boy blurted out, "Did a bear do that?" "Daniel," his father's voice carried a warning. "It's all right," Eleanor assured him, then addressed the boy directly. "It was a mountain lion, actually, 2 years ago." Daniel's eyes grew even wider. "You survived a mountain lion attack? That's incredible." The simple, unguarded admiration in his voice caught her off guard. For 2 years, her scars had been something shameful, something to hide, not a mark of survival to be admired. "I suppose it is," she said, uncertain how to respond to this novel perspective. "My ma died of fever," Daniel continued with the blunt honesty of children. "Pa says surviving hard things makes you stronger, but it leaves marks on you whether people can see them or not." Eleanor glanced at Matthew, who was watching his son with a mixture of pride and pain. "Your father sounds like a wise man," she said softly. "Shall we begin our lesson?" As Daniel settled at her table, Matthew cleared his throat. "I'll return in 2 hours. Unless you'd prefer I stay. Some parents did stay, uncomfortable leaving their children alone with the scarred woman. Eleanor shook her head. That won't be necessary, Mr. Callahan. Daniel will be fine. After he left, she discovered that Daniel's father had been right about his quick mind. The boy struggled terribly with reading, letters shifting and reversing before his eyes. But his comprehension was extraordinary when she read aloud to him. He absorbed information like a sponge, asking insightful questions that challenged even her knowledge. Pa says I'm not slow, Daniel explained as they worked through a difficult passage. Just that my brain works different than most folks. Your father is right again, Eleanor told him. Many brilliant people throughout history have struggled with reading just as you do. When Matthew returned, he found them hunched over a map of the United States, with Daniel correctly identifying state capitals that Eleanor read aloud. He has a remarkable memory, she told Matthew as Daniel gathered his things, and a natural gift for geography and mathematics. Numbers stay put, Daniel explained, not like letters. Matthew's hand came to rest on his son's shoulder, a gesture of quiet pride. What do you say to Miss Reed for today's lesson? Thank you, ma'am, the boy said earnestly. Will you tell me more about the mountain lion next time? After they left, Eleanor found herself smiling, a genuine smile that reached her eyes for the first time in longer than she could remember. The lessons continued 3 times weekly. Daniel made steady progress with the techniques Eleanor taught him, and she found herself looking forward to their sessions with an enthusiasm that had been absent from her life since the attack. One afternoon, as Daniel worked independently, she caught herself watching the clock, anticipating Matthew's return. The realization troubled her. It had been 2 years since she'd allowed herself to think of any man in such a way. 2 years of accepting that her scarred face had removed her from the realm of feminine hopes and desires. When he arrived that day, Matthew didn't immediately leave as usual. Instead, he lingered, examining the books on her shelves with interest. You have quite a collection, he observed. Books have been loyal companions, she replied, then regretted the revealing comment. He turned to face her, his expression thoughtful. Daniel talks about you constantly. Your lessons are the highlight of his week. He's a wonderful student. Matthew's gaze held hers steadily. The last tutor called him hopeless, said he'd never learn to read properly and we were wasting our money. Eleanor felt a surge of indignation. That's absurd. Daniel processes information differently, but he's far from hopeless. That's what I thought, Matthew said with a slight smile. Takes someone special to see past the surface to what's underneath. The words hung between them, carrying meaning beyond their discussion of Daniel. Eleanor looked away first, uncertain how to navigate this unfamiliar territory. We're having a small gathering at the ranch this Sunday, Matthew said, changing the subject. Nothing fancy, just a few neighbors and some of my hands. Daniel would be pleased if you came. The invitation startled her. She hadn't attended a social event since before the attack, had learned to decline the few pity invitations that occasionally came her way. I don't think, she began automatically. Just consider it, he interrupted gently, for Daniel's sake, if nothing else. After they left, Eleanor stood by the window for a long time, watching the path where they'd disappeared. The invitation had awakened something she'd thought long dead, a longing for connection, for normalcy, for the simple pleasure of conversation and company. That night, she stood before her mirror longer than usual, really looking at herself instead of the quick, necessary glances that had become her habit. The scars were still there, 3 jagged lines that pulled slightly at the corner of her eye and mouth. But for the first time, she tried to see them through different eyes, not as disfigurement, but as Matthew had implied, evidence of survival, of strength. Past the surface, she whispered to her reflection, wondering if she dared believe such a thing was possible. Sunday morning found Eleanor standing before her wardrobe, indecision plaguing her as it hadn't in years. Since the attack, she had reduced her life to simple choices: practical clothing, minimal social interaction, a routine that protected her from the pain of rejection. But Matthew's invitation had disrupted that careful order. She finally selected her blue dress, the one she'd sewn the summer before the attack. She hadn't worn it since, saving it for special occasions that never came. As she pinned her hair, she left a few strands loose around her face, not to hide her scars as she once would have, but because she remembered how the style had once suited her. The ride to Blackwater Ranch was longer than she'd expected, giving her ample time to second-guess her decision. Twice, she nearly turned back, the prospect of facing a gathering of strangers overwhelming her hard-won composure. But the memory of Daniel's enthusiasm and Matthew's steady gaze kept her moving forward. The ranch house came into view, larger than she'd imagined, with a wide porch and sturdy corral where several horses grazed. A handful of wagons and horses already indicated the presence of other guests. Eleanor's grip tightened on the reins as anxiety threatened to overcome her. Before she could dismount, the front door opened and Daniel burst out, running toward her with unrestrained excitement. "Miss Reed, you came!" His face was alight with genuine pleasure. "Pa said you might not, but I told him you would." His simple faith in her touched something deep inside. Eleanor managed to smile as Matthew appeared in the doorway, watching them with an expression she couldn't quite read. "Welcome to Blackwater," he said, approaching to help her down from her wagon. His hands were strong and sure at her waist, lingering perhaps a moment longer than necessary. "It's beautiful," she said, taking in the sweeping view of grassland stretching toward distant mountains. "How long have you owned it?" "Just 3 months," he replied, leading her toward the house. "It needs work, but the bones are good." Inside, about a dozen people had gathered, ranch hands and neighboring families. The conversation dimmed noticeably as Eleanor entered, and she felt the familiar weight of eyes upon her face. "Everyone," Matthew's voice carried easily through the room. "This is Miss Eleanor Reed, Daniel's teacher." She steeled herself for the usual reactions, the quick glances away, the whispers, but Matthew's hand remained at the small of her back, a subtle but unmistakable sign of support. To her surprise, a woman approached immediately, extending her hand. "I'm Sarah Cooper from the neighboring ranch. My boys speak highly of you. They were in your class before." She trailed off, color rising in her cheeks. "Before the accident," Eleanor finished for her, accepting her hand. "It's nice to see them again." Something shifted in the room then, as if her direct acknowledgement of what everyone was carefully avoiding had released a collective tension. Conversations resumed, and if some still stared, others made genuine efforts to include her. Daniel stayed close, proudly introducing her to everyone as the smartest person in Willow Creek. His unabashed admiration served as a buffer against the occasional uncomfortable moment. "He thinks the world of you," Matthew observed quietly, as they watched Daniel demonstrating a rope trick to some other children. "The feeling is mutual," she replied. "He's an extraordinary boy. He takes after his mother in that regard." A shadow crossed Matthew's face. She always saw possibilities where others saw only limitations. Eleanor sensed there was more to the story than Daniel's simple explanation of fever, but she didn't press. Everyone carried their own scars, visible or not. As the afternoon progressed, Eleanor found herself relaxing. She spoke with ranch hands about books they'd enjoyed, discussed gardening with Sarah Cooper, and watched with amusement as Daniel organized the children into an elaborate game of his own invention. Later, as the gathering moved outdoors for a meal at long tables set beneath cottonwood trees, Matthew took the seat beside her. "Thank you for coming," he said. "It means more to Daniel than you know." "Only to Daniel?" The words slipped out before she could stop them. His eyes met hers, serious and intent. No, not only to Daniel. Heat rose in her cheeks that had nothing to do with the warm afternoon. Before she could respond, a commotion arose from the children's table, a dispute that required Matthew's attention. Eleanor found herself watching him as he smoothly resolved the conflict, his patience and fairness evident in every word. When he'd first appeared at her door, she'd seen only another parent seeking education for his child. Now she saw so much more: his quiet strength, his thoughtfulness, the deep bond he shared with his son. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in brilliant oranges and purples, guests began to depart. Eleanor knew she should leave as well. The journey back to her cottage would be dark soon, but something held her there, reluctant to break the spell of this unexpected day. "Pa's going to play his fiddle," Daniel announced, tugging at her hand. "You have to stay for that." Before she could protest, Matthew emerged from the house with the instrument. The remaining guests gathered on the porch as he settled into a chair and began to play. The music transformed him. His usual reserve melted away as the haunting strains of a folk melody filled the evening air. Eleanor watched, transfixed by the expression of peace on his face, the skilled movement of his hands, the way the last light caught in his hair. When the song ended, his eyes found hers immediately, as if he'd been playing for her alone. Something passed between them in that moment, fragile and unspoken, but undeniably real. Later, as Matthew walked her to her wagon, darkness had fallen completely, stars emerging in the vast Montana sky. "I'll bring a lantern to light your way home," he said. "It's not necessary. The moon is bright enough." He stopped, turning to face her. In the silvery light, his expression was impossible to read. "Eleanor," he said, her given name sounding different in his voice. "I'm glad you came today." "So am I," she admitted softly. For a moment she thought he might say more, or perhaps do more, but Daniel called from the porch, breaking the spell. As she drove home through the moonlit landscape, Eleanor realized that for hours she had forgotten to be conscious of her scars. For the first time in 2 years, she had simply been herself, not the marked woman, not the object of pity. Just Eleanor Reed, enjoying the company of others. The revelation was as terrifying as it was exhilarating. Word traveled quickly in Willow Creek. By Tuesday morning, Eleanor's appearance at the Blackwater Ranch gathering was the subject of intense speculation. She felt the change immediately when she entered the general store. Conversations hushed, then resumed with greater animation, eyes following her with renewed interest, rather than the habitual pity she'd grown accustomed to. "Good morning, Miss Reed," Mrs. Donovan called with unusual warmth. "Heard you had a fine time at the Callahan place Sunday last." "It was a pleasant afternoon," Eleanor replied cautiously. "Mr. Callahan seems to be settling in well," the shopkeeper continued, her eyes keen with curiosity. "Quite the eligible widower with that fine ranch and all." Eleanor kept her expression neutral as she selected the items she needed. The implication was clear. Matthew's status as a property owner made him desirable, while her scarred face made any connection between them worthy of gossip. As she paid for her purchases, Mrs. Donovan leaned closer. "Just mind yourself, dear. Men like that, handsome, well-established, they don't usually look twice at—" She trailed off, but her meaning was unmistakable. "At women like me," Eleanor finished for her, refusing to shrink from the cruel assessment. "Thank you for your concern, Mrs. Donovan, but I'm Daniel's teacher, nothing more." The lie tasted bitter, though she couldn't have explained why. What was Matthew to her, really? A parent of a student, a man who'd shown her basic human kindness, perhaps a friend, but certainly nothing that warranted this speculation. Yet as she left the store, the memory of his eyes finding hers across the fire-lit gathering, the way his hand had steadied her at the small of her back, the sound of her name in his voice, these things followed her, warming her despite the morning chill. That afternoon, Daniel arrived for his lesson without his father, explaining that Matthew had business in town. Eleanor told herself the flicker of disappointment she felt was absurd. Still, the lesson passed with her attention divided, her ears straining for the sound of approaching hoofbeats that never came. As Daniel was preparing to leave, he paused. "Miss Reed, can I ask you something?" "Of course." "Do your scars hurt? Still, I mean?" The question, delivered with a child's direct curiosity, caught her off guard. "Sometimes," she admitted, "when the weather changes, but mostly they're just there." Daniel nodded thoughtfully. "Pa has scars too, but you can't see most of them." Eleanor's hands stilled in the act of organizing papers. "What do you mean?" "From the war. He got shot here." Daniel pointed to his shoulder. "And here," he indicated his side, "but he says the ones nobody can see are the ones that wake him up shouting sometimes." The revelation settled over Eleanor like a mantle. Of course, the disciplined bearing, the watchful eyes, the way he positioned himself to see all entrances to a room. "Was he in the cavalry?" she asked softly. Daniel nodded. "Pa was a scout. Says he saw terrible things. That's why we moved so much after Ma died. He couldn't sleep in one place too long." "But you've settled here now," Eleanor observed. "Pa says it's time to stop running. Says a man can't outride his memories, so he might as well face them." Daniel shouldered his bag. "He likes it when you're around, you know. He smiles more." Before Eleanor could formulate a response, a horse approached outside. Daniel grinned. "That's Jimmy from the ranch. Jimmy. Pa sent him to fetch me." After Daniel left, Eleanor sat at her table for a long time, turning this new knowledge over in her mind. Matthew Callahan carried scars of his own, invisible but no less real than the marks on her face. The war, his wife's death, years of restless wandering with a young son, each had left its imprint. Yet he had chosen to stop running, to build something permanent. The next day brought heavy rain, transforming the dirt roads into muddy tracks. Eleanor had just stoked her fire against the unusual chill when a knock came at her door. She opened it to find Matthew standing on her porch, rain dripping from his hat brim, his expression grave. "Mr. Callahan," she said, surprised. "Is everything all right? Is Daniel—" "Daniel's fine," he assured her quickly. "May I come in for a moment?" She stepped back, suddenly conscious of her simple house dress and loosened hair. He removed his hat and coat, hanging them carefully on her coat rack. Without them, he seemed both more and less imposing, his height and breadth more evident in her small cottage, yet something in his manner more vulnerable. "I owe you an apology," he said without preamble. "Whatever for." "I've heard the talk in town. My invitation has made you the subject of gossip." Eleanor shook her head. "That's hardly your fault. Gossip is Willow Creek's chief industry." A smile ghosted across his features. "Nevertheless, I should have considered how it might appear. A single woman visiting a widower's ranch would hardly raise eyebrows if the woman in question had a whole face," she interrupted, surprising herself with her bluntness. His expression shifted, eyes darkening. "Is that what you think? That people are talking because of your scars? Aren't they?" The unmarriageable schoolteacher daring to socialize with the eligible newcomer. "It's quite the scandal." Matthew stepped closer, his voice lowering. "Eleanor, do you know what people are actually saying? They're wondering what a rough, battle-scarred rancher could possibly offer a woman of your education and refinement." She stared at him, certain she'd misheard. "That's absurd." "Is it? You speak 3 languages. You've read more books than most people in this territory combined. You understand things I can barely pronounce." His voice was earnest, his eyes holding hers. "Daniel told me you're teaching him Latin." "Only a few phrases," she murmured, disoriented by this unexpected perspective. The point is, he continued, if there's an imbalance between us, it's not the one you imagine. The rain drummed against the roof, filling the silence that stretched between them. Eleanor struggled to reconcile his words with the reality she'd lived for 2 years. The pity, the averted gazes, the careful distance people maintained. "Why are you really here, Mr. Callahan?" she asked finally. "Matthew," he corrected gently, "and I came because I couldn't bear the thought that I'd caused you discomfort." He hesitated, then added more quietly, "And because I wanted to see you." The simple admission, "I wanted to see you," hung in the air between them. Eleanor felt her heartbeat quicken, a sensation she'd thought long forgotten. For 2 years, she'd been careful to want nothing beyond her books and her solitude, to expect nothing beyond tolerance from others. Matthew's words threatened that carefully constructed acceptance. "Would you like some tea?" she asked, retreating to the safety of hospitality. "Thank you," he said, seemingly content to let the moment pass. As she busied herself with the kettle, Eleanor was acutely aware of Matthew's presence filling her small home. He moved to her bookshelf, examining the titles with genuine interest. "You've read all of these?" he asked, running his finger along the spine of a volume of Shakespeare. "Most of them. Books were my companions growing up. My father was the schoolmaster in a small town in Pennsylvania." "Was?" Matthew asked gently. "He and my mother died of influenza 5 years ago." She placed the kettle on the stove. "I came west afterward looking for something different, and found a mountain lion instead," he said, his voice holding no pity, only a recognition of life's unpredictable turns. Eleanor smiled faintly. "Not immediately. I taught here for 3 years before the attack. I was gathering wildflowers for the schoolroom when it happened." She hadn't spoken of that day to anyone in Willow Creek. People knew the basic facts: mountain lion, severe injuries, brave rescue by hunters who heard her screams. But she had never shared the experience itself. "I remember thinking, as it came at me, that I'd never seen anything so beautiful and terrifying," she continued, surprising herself with the words that came. "I didn't feel the first strike, just saw its eyes, amber and ancient, looking at me as if I were nothing more than meat." Matthew had gone still, listening with an intensity that drew the story from her. "The pain came later, in waves. I remember the sky above me so blue it hurt to look at, and thinking it was a strange last thing to see." She touched her scars unconsciously. "The hunters found me before I bled out. The doctor said it was a miracle I survived." "Some would call it strength," Matthew said quietly. The kettle whistled, giving Eleanor a moment to compose herself. She poured the tea with hands that trembled slightly, both from the memory and from the strange intimacy of sharing it. "What about you?" she asked, passing him a cup. "Daniel mentioned you were in the war." A shadow crossed his face. "Cavalry scout, 4 years that felt like 40. Is that where you met Daniel's mother?" Matthew nodded. "Mary was a nurse at a field hospital in Virginia. We married after Appomattox." His voice softened at the memory. "She was the bravest person I ever knew, tending wounded men from both sides while shells fell all around." "Daniel has her courage," Eleanor observed, "and her heart." Matthew's smile was tinged with sadness. "After she died, I couldn't stay in one place. Kept thinking if we just moved on, the grief might not follow. But it did. Like my own shadow." He met her eyes directly. "Until recently." The implication in his words made Eleanor's breath catch. She had spent 2 years learning to expect nothing, to be grateful for mere civility. The possibility that this man, this kind, perceptive man, might see beyond her scars to the woman beneath was almost too much to bear. "Matthew," she began, uncertain what she meant to say. A sudden crash of thunder made them both start. The rain, which had been steady, now hammered against the roof and windows with renewed vigor. "The creek will be rising," Matthew said, moving to look outside. "I should go before the road becomes impassable." Eleanor knew he was right. The creek that ran between her cottage and town could quickly become dangerous in heavy rain, but she felt a sharp disappointment at the thought of his leaving. As he retrieved his hat and coat, Matthew paused. "There's another reason I came today," he said. "Daniel's birthday is next Saturday. He wants very much for you to join us for dinner to celebrate." "I'd be honored," she replied, genuinely touched by the invitation. Matthew hesitated at the door, rainwater already pooling on her porch beyond. "Eleanor," he said, her name soft in his mouth. "What I said earlier, about wanting to see you, I hope that doesn't make you uncomfortable." She found herself suddenly, inexplicably brave. "It doesn't. In fact, I'm glad you came." Something shifted in his expression then, a warmth that made her forget the storm raging outside. Before she could interpret it fully, he stepped closer, slowly, deliberately giving her every chance to retreat. She didn't. His hand, when it touched her face, was calloused but infinitely gentle, fingers tracing the line of her jaw before coming to rest lightly against her scarred cheek. No one had touched her face since the doctor who'd stitched her wounds. "May I?" he asked, voice barely audible above the rain. She nodded, unable to speak, uncertain what she was agreeing to, but knowing she wanted whatever it might be. Matthew leaned down, his lips brushing hers with exquisite tenderness. The kiss was brief, questioning rather than demanding, but it sent warmth coursing through Eleanor's body, awakening sensations she'd thought forever lost to her. When he drew back, his eyes searched hers, looking for regret or uncertainty. Instead, he found wonder and a fragile hope. "I should go," he said again, though he made no move toward the door. "Yes," she agreed, equally motionless. Another crash of thunder broke the spell. Matthew straightened, his hand falling reluctantly from her face. "I'll see you Saturday, if not before." As he stepped out into the downpour, Eleanor touched her fingers to her lips, still warm from his kiss. For the first time in 2 years, she looked toward the future with something more than resignation, a cautious anticipation that frightened and thrilled her in equal measure. That night, she dreamed not of mountain lions with amber eyes, but of storm-gray eyes that saw beyond her scars to the woman she had almost forgotten she could be. The days following Matthew's visit passed in a blur for Eleanor. She found herself touching her lips absently while reading, reliving the gentle pressure of his kiss, then scolding herself for such schoolgirl behavior. At 38, she had believed that part of her life long finished, yet here she was, heart quickening at the memory of storm-gray eyes and a touch that had treated her scars as something precious rather than repulsive. Daniel's lessons continued, but Matthew sent the ranch hand Jimmy to escort the boy instead of coming himself. Eleanor told herself this was practical rather than purposeful. The ranch demanded attention, especially with Daniel's birthday preparations underway. But doubt crept in nonetheless. Perhaps Matthew regretted the kiss, the moment of vulnerability shared between them. "Pa's building something big," Daniel confided during Thursday's lesson. "Won't let me near the barn for days now. Says it's a surprise." "For your birthday?" Eleanor asked, helping him sound out a difficult word. Daniel nodded enthusiastically, and he bought a new shirt to wear for Saturday. Made Jimmy ride all the way to Helena to get it. The boy looked up with innocent perception. "I think it's because you're coming." Eleanor felt warmth rise in her cheeks. "I'm sure your father wants to look his best for your special day." "Miss Reed," Daniel said, setting down his pencil, "do you like my pa?" The directness of the question startled her. "Of course I do," He's a good man and a wonderful father. No, I mean... Daniel's face scrunched in concentration. Do you like him? Like Mrs. Cooper likes Mr. Cooper? Eleanor couldn't help but smile at the comparison to the affectionate couple who owned the neighboring ranch. That's a very personal question, Daniel. Pa likes you, he continued undeterred. I can tell. He looks at you the way he used to look at Ma in the photograph I have. The simple observation struck Eleanor speechless. Before she could formulate a response, Jimmy arrived to collect Daniel, saving her from addressing the boy's startling insight. Friday brought Eleanor to town for supplies, both for Daniel's gift, a leather-bound journal she thought might encourage his storytelling talents, and for herself. She'd decided to wear her green dress to the birthday dinner, the one she'd sewn just before the attack but never had occasion to wear. It needed minor alterations, which meant a visit to the mercantile for thread. Mrs. Donovan's curious eyes followed her as she made her selections. Making something new, Miss Reed? Just alterations, Eleanor replied, keeping her tone casual. For tomorrow's dinner at Blackwater, I presume? At Eleanor's surprised look, Mrs. Donovan smiled knowingly. Small towns, dear. No secrets. As Eleanor paid for her purchases, the shopkeeper leaned closer. Just a friendly word of caution. Judith Parker has set her cap for Mr. Callahan since he arrived. She won't take kindly to competition. Eleanor stiffened. Judith Parker was the banker's daughter, a pretty young widow of 25 with a flawless complexion and a substantial inheritance. There is no competition, Mrs. Donovan. I'm simply Daniel's teacher attending his birthday celebration. The shopkeeper's expression was skeptical but kindly. If you say so, dear, but I've seen the way Mr. Callahan looks at you when you're not watching, and it's not the way a man looks at his son's teacher. The words followed Eleanor home, mingling with Daniel's innocent observation and her own cautious hopes into a confusing tangle of emotion. She had spent 2 years believing her future held nothing but solitude, that no man would see beyond her scarred face to the woman beneath. Now Matthew's kiss and these observations from others suggested a possibility she hardly dared contemplate. Saturday dawned clear and warm for late September. Eleanor spent the morning putting final touches on Daniel's gift and altering her dress, which now fit perfectly, its deep green bringing out the amber flecks in her hazel eyes. For the first time since the attack, she arranged her hair with care, pinning it so that it framed her face without attempting to hide her scars. As she prepared to leave, she caught her reflection in the mirror. The woman who looked back was neither the unblemished schoolteacher of 3 years ago, nor the haunted, hidden figure of recent years. Instead, she saw someone new, marked but not defined by her scars, eyes bright with possibility rather than shadowed by resignation. Jimmy arrived promptly at 4 to escort her to the ranch. Mr. Callahan sends his apologies for not coming himself, ma'am. Says he's putting final touches on the surprise. Blackwater Ranch looked transformed as they approached. Lanterns hung from the porch eaves, their light unnecessary in the afternoon sun but promising warm illumination for the evening ahead. Fresh flowers adorned every window, and a hand-painted banner reading, "Happy Birthday, Daniel," stretched across the front of the house. Eleanor had barely dismounted when Daniel burst from the door, vibrating with excitement. "You came. Pa said to show you in right away. He's still in the barn." Inside, the ranch house had been thoroughly cleaned, with more flowers adorning the mantel and a table set with what appeared to be the finest china and silver Blackwater possessed. A small pile of wrapped gifts sat on a side table. "Pa said I can't open presents until after dinner," Daniel explained, leading her through the house, "but he's terrible at keeping secrets. I already know Aunt Sarah and Uncle James got me a saddle. I saw them bringing it in." "Daniel," Matthew's voice called from outside. "Is Miss Reed here?" "Yes, Pa. Bring her out to the barn then. It's time for the surprise." Daniel practically dragged Eleanor outside, his excitement contagious. As they approached the barn, Matthew emerged, wiping his hands on a cloth. He'd clearly just cleaned up after working. His hair was damp, his fresh shirt crisp against sun-bronzed skin. When he saw Eleanor, he stopped mid-motion, his eyes taking in her appearance with such obvious appreciation that she felt herself blush. "You look beautiful," he said simply. Before she could respond, Daniel tugged at her hand. "Come see, Miss Reed." Inside the barn, gleaming in the slanted afternoon light, stood a wheeled chair unlike any Eleanor had seen before. Crafted of polished wood and leather with large spoked wheels and smaller turning wheels at the front, it was both practical and elegantly designed. "It's for Mrs. Peterson," Daniel explained proudly. "Pa made it so she can move around by herself instead of being carried everywhere." Eleanor turned to Matthew in surprise. Mrs. Peterson was an elderly widow who had lost the use of her legs to polio decades earlier. She rarely left her small house, dependent on neighbors for everything. "Daniel mentioned that you'd spoken about devices in European hospitals that allow patients with paralysis some independence," Matthew explained. "I thought Mrs. Peterson might benefit from something similar." The thoughtfulness of the gesture, not just for Mrs. Peterson but his attention to conversations between her and Daniel, touched Eleanor deeply. This wasn't the act of a man interested in superficial courtship, but one who listened, who cared, who saw ways to ease others' burdens. "Matthew, it's remarkable," Eleanor said, running her hand along the smooth wooden arm of the chair. "How did you design it?" "Based on Daniel's description in some medical journals I found in Helena." He shrugged modestly. "The wheels came from a broken wagon. The rest is just carpentry." "Just carpentry," she echoed with a smile, "like the Sistine Chapel is just painting." Daniel bounced impatiently between them. "Can we show Mrs. Peterson tomorrow, Pa? Can Miss Reed come too?" "If Miss Reed would like to," Matthew replied, his eyes meeting hers. "I'd be honored," she said. The thought of witnessing Mrs. Peterson's face when presented with this gift that would transform her life, it was a privilege she wouldn't miss. Their moment was interrupted by the sound of approaching horses. Daniel ran to the barn door. "More guests," he announced, then his face fell slightly. "It's Miss Parker and her father." Eleanor felt a flutter of anxiety. Judith Parker's interest in Matthew was well known, and her unexpected arrival seemed deliberate rather than coincidental. Matthew's expression tightened briefly before he composed himself. "Well, Daniel, as host, you should greet them properly." They emerged from the barn to find Judith Parker dismounting with practiced grace, her riding habit fashionably tailored to emphasize her slender figure. Behind her, the banker, a portly man with calculating eyes, surveyed the property with obvious interest. "Mr. Callahan," Judith called, her voice carrying the affected refinement of someone who believed themselves above their surroundings. "What a lovely day for a celebration." Her eyes flicked to Eleanor, noting the green dress and carefully arranged hair, before dismissing her with practiced indifference. "Miss Parker, Mr. Parker," Matthew greeted them with polite restraint. "This is unexpected." Judith smiled brilliantly. "We were simply riding by and remembered it was young Daniel's birthday. We wouldn't dream of intruding, but since we happened to have a small gift..." She produced a wrapped package from her saddlebag. Daniel, ever courteous despite his visible disappointment, thanked her appropriately. Eleanor hung back, suddenly feeling out of place as Judith moved confidently to Matthew's side, laying a familiar hand on his arm. "Mr. Callahan," Mr. Parker boomed, "just the man I wanted to see. I've been considering your loan application for those breeding cattle. Perhaps we could discuss terms while we're here." Eleanor caught the flash of surprise on Matthew's face. Clearly, there had been no intention of discussing business at his son's birthday celebration. Nevertheless, he nodded with stiff courtesy. "Perhaps after dinner, Mr. Parker." Inside, the intimate celebration Eleanor had anticipated had suddenly transformed into something more formal. Judith immediately took charge, rearranging the table settings and directing Jimmy on where to place additional chairs as if she were already mistress of Blackwater Ranch. "Miss Reed," she said sweetly, "how kind of you to join us. Daniel speaks so highly of his lessons with you." The emphasis on lessons made Eleanor's position clear. She was the tutor, nothing more. "Daniel is an exceptional student," Eleanor replied evenly. "He certainly needs a firm educational foundation." Judith lowered her voice conspiratorially. "His father has such ambitions for him. Mr. Callahan was just telling me how he hopes Daniel might attend university back east someday. Such opportunities require particular advantages." The implication was clear. Advantages that the banker's daughter could provide through her family connections and wealth. Advantages a scarred schoolteacher could never offer. Eleanor felt the familiar urge to retreat, to protect herself from the subtle cruelty. Instead, she thought of Matthew's gentle touch on her scarred cheek, his whispered words, "I wanted to see you." Drawing strength from that memory, she met Judith's gaze directly. "I believe the greatest advantage any child can have is being valued for who they truly are," she said quietly. "Daniel is fortunate that his father understands that so well." Before Judith could respond, Matthew appeared at Eleanor's side. "There you are," he said, his hand coming to rest lightly at the small of her back in a gesture that didn't escape Judith's notice. "Daniel's eager to show you something before dinner." He guided Eleanor toward the parlor, leaning close to murmur, "I'm sorry about this. Their arrival wasn't part of the plan." "It's all right," she assured him, though uncertainty gnawed at her. Why had Matthew been discussing Daniel's education with Judith Parker? How often had they spoken while he sent Jimmy to collect Daniel from lessons? In the parlor, Daniel proudly showed Eleanor a collection of arrowheads and fossils he'd gathered since moving to Blackwater. His enthusiasm was contagious, momentarily distracting her from her troubled thoughts. "This one looks like a bird," he explained, showing her a small stone with a delicate imprint. "Pa says it's millions of years old. Imagine that, Miss Reed, millions of years, and I'm the one who found it." "That's remarkable, Daniel," she said sincerely. "Perhaps you'll be a natural historian someday." His face lit up. "Do you think I could, even with my reading trouble?" "I know you could," she replied. "Some of history's greatest minds saw the world differently than others. That difference is often what allows them to make discoveries no one else can see." Matthew, who had been watching from the doorway, stepped forward. "Your teacher is right, Daniel. Your mind works exactly as it should, uniquely yours." The dinner that followed was a study in contrasts. Daniel's excitement about his birthday and the presence of guests he cared about, Eleanor, the Coopers who arrived shortly after, and a few ranch hands, contrasted sharply with the obvious maneuvering of the Parkers. Judith positioned herself beside Matthew, touching his arm frequently and referencing conversations they'd apparently shared. Mr. Parker spoke loudly of business opportunities, expansion possibilities, and the advantages of proper connections in a developing territory. Throughout, Matthew remained polite but increasingly reserved. Eleanor noticed how his eyes sought hers across the table whenever Judith's attention was diverted, how he redirected conversations back to Daniel whenever possible. When the cake was finally brought out, baked by Sarah Cooper and decorated with 12 candles, Daniel's face glowed with happiness. "Make a wish, son," Matthew said, as the boy prepared to blow out the candles. Daniel closed his eyes tightly, his expression one of intense concentration, then blew with all his might. As everyone applauded, he leaned close to Eleanor. "I can't tell what I wished for," he whispered, "but I think you'd like it." The moment was interrupted by Judith's melodious laugh at something Matthew had supposedly said, though Eleanor noted that his expression didn't match the intimacy Judith's reaction suggested. As the evening progressed to the opening of gifts, Eleanor watched Daniel's face light up with each carefully wrapped package. The Cooper's saddle was received with whoops of joy. Matthew's gift of a pocket watch that had belonged to his own father brought tears to the boy's eyes. And Jimmy's hand-carved set of wooden animals earned a fierce hug that made the ranch hand blush to his ears. When Daniel unwrapped Eleanor's journal, his reaction was everything she had hoped for. "It's beautiful," he breathed, running his fingers over the embossed leather cover. "And look, Pa, the pages have lines already drawn to keep my writing straight." "Miss Reed understands you well," Matthew said, his warm gaze meeting Eleanor's across the room. Judith Parker cleared her throat delicately. "Our gift next, Daniel." She handed him the small package with the air of someone bestowing a great honor. Inside was an expensive fountain pen, clearly chosen to impress the adults rather than delight the child. Daniel thanked her politely, but Eleanor noticed the pen was quickly set aside in favor of the journal, which he kept returning to touch. "Perhaps Miss Reed could help you use that pen to fill your journal," Judith suggested sweetly, "since writing is part of her professional duties." "Actually," Matthew interjected, "I thought Eleanor might help Daniel document our trip to Yellowstone next month. If she's willing to join us, of course." The invitation, delivered so casually yet so deliberately, landed like a thunderclap in the room. Mr. Parker's eyebrows shot up, Sarah Cooper suppressed a smile, and Judith's carefully composed expression faltered visibly. "Yellowstone?" Eleanor echoed, caught completely off guard. "Yes," Daniel exclaimed, bouncing in his seat. "Pa promised we'd see the geysers and hot springs. Will you come, Miss Reed? Please." Before Eleanor could formulate a response, Judith intervened. "Such a journey requires considerable preparation, Matthew. I've already mentioned to the ladies' auxiliary that I might coordinate supplies for your expedition." Matthew's expression remained neutral, but his voice carried a quiet finality. "That's thoughtful, Judith, but unnecessary. Our arrangements are nearly complete." The remainder of the evening unfolded with growing tension beneath the celebratory veneer. As guests began to depart, Eleanor found herself helping Daniel arrange his gifts, while Matthew escorted the Coopers to their wagon. The Parkers remained. Judith engaged in pointed conversation with Matthew by the door, while her father inspected the craftsmanship of the ranch house with unconcealed assessment. "Miss Reed," Daniel said suddenly, his voice low, "why does Miss Parker keep touching Pa's arm like that? Ma never did that with other men." Eleanor chose her words carefully. "Some people express friendship differently, Daniel." "She's not being friendly," he replied with startling perception. "She's marking territory, like the wolves Pa showed me last spring." Despite the seriousness of the moment, Eleanor had to suppress a laugh at the apt comparison. "Well, your father is quite capable of making his own decisions about territories." "He already has," Daniel stated with absolute certainty. "He told me so." Before Eleanor could question this intriguing revelation, Judith approached, her smile tight with barely concealed irritation. "Such a lovely evening," she said, her voice carrying to where Matthew stood with her father. "Though I worry these late hours might be difficult for someone in your condition, Miss Reed." Eleanor stiffened. "My condition?" Dr. Morrison mentioned that mountain lion victims often suffer lasting effects beyond the visible. Nerve damage, headaches, confusion under stress. Her concern was performative, her true message clear. Eleanor was damaged goods, unsuitable for the future Judith envisioned for Matthew and Blackwater Ranch. 2 years ago, such words would have sent Eleanor retreating into protective isolation, But Matthew's steady gaze across the room gave her strength she hadn't known she possessed. "How fortunate I've experienced none of those symptoms," she replied evenly. "Just as fortunate as surviving it all, which Dr. Morrison once called miraculous." "Yes, survival is certainly admirable," Judith conceded with practiced sympathy. "Though one must consider the quality of life afterward, the limitations." "The only limitations I've experienced," Eleanor said quietly, "were those imposed by people uncomfortable with the reminder that life can change in an instant, that beauty and safety are never guaranteed." Matthew appeared at her side, his presence solid and reassuring. "The Parkers are leaving," he announced, his hand coming to rest lightly on Eleanor's shoulder. "I'll see them out, then return." As he escorted them outside, Daniel moved closer to Eleanor. "You aren't limited," he said fiercely. "You're the bravest person I know except for Pa." Eleanor's heart swelled at the boy's loyalty. "Thank you, Daniel. That means more than you know." When Matthew returned, his expression was grim but determined. "Daniel, time for bed. Say goodnight to Miss Reed." After Daniel's enthusiastic hugs and thank yous, Matthew walked Eleanor to the porch while the boy prepared for bed. The night had turned cool, stars brilliant in the vast Montana sky. For a moment, they stood in silence, the evening's tensions slowly dissipating in the peaceful darkness. "I'm sorry about the Parkers," Matthew said finally. "Their arrival was unexpected and unwelcome." "Judith seems quite invested in your future," Eleanor observed carefully. Matthew's laugh held no humor. "Judith Parker is invested in Blackwater Ranch and the status of being a successful rancher's wife. If someone else owned this property, her attentions would follow accordingly." "And the discussions about Daniel's education, his future opportunities?" He turned to face her fully, his expression serious in the lantern light. "I've had exactly one conversation with Judith about Daniel's education, when she insisted that his reading difficulties could be corrected with proper discipline. I informed her that my son was perfect exactly as he is." Relief washed through Eleanor, followed by shame for doubting him. "I'm sorry, I shouldn't have—" "No," he interrupted gently. "You've had 2 years of people seeing only what's on the surface. I understand why trust doesn't come easily." He reached up slowly, his fingers brushing her scarred cheek with deliberate tenderness. "But I need you to understand something, Eleanor. When I look at you, I see a woman of extraordinary courage and grace. These marks," his thumb traced the longest scar with exquisite care, "they tell me how strong you are, not how damaged." The words, spoken with such quiet conviction under the star-filled sky, brought tears to Eleanor's eyes. For 2 years she had seen her scars as the end of something, her beauty, her prospects, her place in the world. Matthew saw them as evidence of her beginning, her survival, her strength. "I don't know what to say," Eleanor whispered, overwhelmed by his words. "You don't need to say anything," Matthew replied, his hand still gentle against her scarred cheek. "Just believe it." For 2 years, Eleanor had carried her scars as a burden, each pitying glance and whispered comment reinforcing her belief that she had become something less beautiful, less worthy, less complete. Now this man, with his quiet strength and perceptive gaze, was asking her to see them differently, to recognize in herself what he apparently saw so clearly. "About Yellowstone," she began, needing to address his surprising invitation. "I meant it," he said. "Daniel and I want you to come with us, but only if you want to." The prospect of traveling together, of being seen as a unit, almost like a family, was both thrilling and terrifying. "People will talk," she warned. "People already talk," Matthew countered, a hint of amusement in his voice. "At least give them something worthwhile to discuss." His easy dismissal of potential gossip struck her forcefully. For years, she had structured her life around avoiding exactly that: whispers, stares, judgment. Matthew seemed utterly unconcerned with others' opinions. "Mrs. Peterson first," she said, making a decision. "Let's see how tomorrow goes." He nodded, understanding her need to take smaller steps. "Tomorrow, then. Oh, I should check on Daniel." As he turned to go, Eleanor found herself caught between competing impulses: the habit of caution that had protected her for so long, and a new, fragile courage that Matthew's words had awakened. The latter won. "Matthew," she called softly. When he turned back, she rose on tiptoes and pressed her lips to his, a brief kiss that nonetheless conveyed more than words could express. His arms came around her waist, steadying her, deepening the contact for one heartbeat, then two, before they separated. "Good night, Eleanor," he murmured, his voice rougher than before. "Good night." The following morning dawned clear and crisp, autumn asserting itself in earnest, with frost silvering the grass as Eleanor prepared for the day. The memory of Matthew's words and their kiss kept intruding on her practical preparations, bringing unexpected smiles to her face as she dressed and arranged her hair. Matthew and Daniel arrived precisely at 9, the wheelchair secured in the back of their wagon. Daniel chattered excitedly throughout the journey to Mrs. Peterson's small house at the edge of town, while Matthew drove with one hand, occasionally reaching across to touch Eleanor's, as if reassuring himself of her presence. Mrs. Peterson's modest home, kept scrupulously clean despite her mobility challenges, reflected her diminished circumstances since her husband's death. Her caregiver, a stern woman named Mrs. Hollister, answered their knock with poorly concealed surprise at seeing Eleanor with the Callahans. "Mrs. Peterson isn't receiving visitors today," she announced, already closing the door. "We've brought her something," Daniel piped up, "something important." "Is that Daniel Callahan I hear?" called a wavering voice from inside. "Let them in, Agnes. I've been expecting them." Mrs. Peterson sat in her usual chair by the window, thin hands folded in her lap, her once tall frame now bent with age and illness. Her eyes, however, remained sharp and observant, taking in Eleanor's presence beside Matthew with evident interest. "Miss Reed," she greeted warmly. "It's been too long since you visited. And Mr. Callahan, always a pleasure." Her gaze shifted to Daniel. "Now, young man, what's this important something you've brought?" Matthew nodded to Daniel, who could barely contain his excitement. "We made you a special chair, Mrs. Peterson. Pa built it so you can move around by yourself instead of waiting for Mrs. Hollister all the time." Mrs. Peterson's eyes widened as Matthew brought in the wheelchair. Eleanor watched the elderly woman's face transform as she understood what she was seeing. Not just a chair, but independence she had lost decades ago. "May I?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. With gentle care, Matthew and Eleanor helped transfer Mrs. Peterson to the wheelchair. The caregiver watched skeptically, arms folded across her chest. "The wheels are positioned so you can push them yourself," Matthew explained, demonstrating the motion. "And these smaller ones at the front allow you to turn. It will take some practice." Mrs. Peterson's gnarled hands gripped the wheels experimentally, and the chair moved forward. Her gasp of delight was like a child's on Christmas morning. "I'm moving," she whispered, tears gathering in her eyes. "By myself, after all these years." For the next hour, they watched as Mrs. Peterson navigated her small home with increasing confidence, Matthew occasionally adjusting the chair for better performance. Daniel demonstrated how the footrests worked, while Eleanor observed the transformation in the elderly woman's demeanor, from resigned dependency to renewed dignity. "Young man," Mrs. Peterson said finally, addressing Matthew with red-rimmed eyes, "in my 73 years I've received many gifts. None has ever given me back myself the way this has." Even Mrs. Hollister seemed moved, her stern demeanor softening as she recognized how the wheelchair would change both their lives. As they prepared to leave, Mrs. Peterson beckoned Eleanor closer. "He's a good man," she murmured, nodding toward Matthew, who was showing Mrs. Hollister how to oil the wheel mechanisms, the kind who sees beyond surfaces to what matters. "Yes," Eleanor agreed softly, "he is. And you, my dear," the older woman continued, patting Eleanor's hand, "are finally allowing others to see the woman you've always been, scars and all." Outside, as Matthew helped Eleanor into the wagon, Daniel announced he wanted to walk back to town to visit his friend from school. After extracting promises to be careful and meet them at the Mercantile later, Matthew clicked the horses into motion. "Mrs. Peterson seemed happy," he observed as they left the small house behind. "Happy doesn't begin to describe it," Eleanor replied. "You've given her freedom she hasn't known in years." "We all need freedom," he said quietly. "Freedom to move, to choose, to be seen for who we truly are." The weight of his words settled between them, meaningful and full of promise. As they approached town, however, the sight of Judith Parker emerging from her father's bank dampened Eleanor's momentary peace. Judith spotted them immediately, her expression darkening before she composed herself and approached their wagon. "Matthew, how fortunate to see you," she called. "Father was just asking when you might come discuss those loan terms." Matthew's grip on the reins tightened imperceptibly. "Miss Parker," he acknowledged, "I'm afraid today isn't convenient. Eleanor and I have plans." Judith's carefully composed smile faltered. "Surely Miss Reed wouldn't mind if you attended to important business matters." She emphasized important in a way that made clear her assessment of Eleanor's relative significance. "Actually," Eleanor said, surprising herself with her steady voice, "we're delivering news to Reverend Collins about the success of Matthew's wheelchair for Mrs. Peterson. The Reverend believes similar chairs might benefit others in the community." Matthew's appreciative glance warmed her. "Precisely. Please tell your father I'll schedule a meeting next week." Before Judith could respond, they continued toward the church, leaving her standing in the street. Once out of earshot, Matthew released a long breath. "Thank you," he said. "I've been avoiding that conversation." "The loan?" Eleanor asked carefully. Matthew nodded. "Blackwater needs improvements. Irrigation, better fencing, a proper barn. The Parkers' bank is the only option in Willow Creek, but their terms—" He trailed off, clearly uncomfortable. "Include more than financial considerations," Eleanor finished for him. "Judith has made it clear that a merger of properties and families would solve my financial constraints." His jaw tightened. "I'd rather lose the ranch than marry for convenience or property." The church appeared ahead, but Matthew guided the horses past it, continuing toward the edge of town. Eleanor raised a questioning eyebrow. "I thought we might enjoy the view from the ridge," he explained, "unless you'd prefer to return." "The ridge sounds perfect." They traveled in comfortable silence until reaching the overlook where Willow Creek spread below them, buildings miniaturized by distance, surrounded by the vast Montana landscape. Matthew helped Eleanor down, his hands lingering at her waist. "I need to tell you something," he said, his expression serious. "About the loan, about Blackwater's future." Eleanor's heart constricted with sudden fear. Was he leaving? Had the financial pressures become too great? "I received a letter yesterday from my former commanding officer," Matthew continued. "He's established a breeding program for cavalry horses in Wyoming. He's offered me a partnership, my land and experience for his capital and connections." "That's wonderful," Eleanor said, genuinely relieved. "You won't need the Parkers' loan." "No," Matthew agreed, "but it would mean frequent travel, at least initially, which brings me to what I really want to discuss." He took her hands in his expression intense. "I've known you less than 2 months, Eleanor Reed, yet I cannot imagine my future, or Daniel's, without you in it." The directness of his words stole her breath. For 2 years, she had believed her future contained only solitude and careful distance. Now this man and his remarkable son had upended every expectation. "I'm not asking for an answer today," he continued. "Only that you consider a future where you don't face the world alone, where your scars are honored, not hidden, where you're loved for exactly who you are." "Loved," she whispered, the word both terrifying and exhilarating. "Deeply," he confirmed, his thumb brushing across her knuckles. "By both of us." Eleanor looked out over the valley, the town where she had experienced both devastating loss and unexpected rebirth. "I've spent 2 years believing these marks define my future," she said, touching her scarred cheek, "that they limited what I could hope for, what I deserved." "They define nothing except your courage," Matthew replied. "I'm beginning to believe that," she admitted, "because of you, because you saw me when others looked away." The weeks that followed transformed Eleanor's life in ways she could never have anticipated. The story of Mrs. Peterson's wheelchair spread through town, shifting perceptions of both Matthew's ingenuity and Eleanor's involvement. When they traveled to Yellowstone as planned, accompanied by Daniel's boundless enthusiasm, few eyebrows raised at their unconventional party. The splendors of Yellowstone, geysers erupting toward the heavens, prismatic springs shimmering with impossible colors, wildlife roaming freely across meadows, seemed to mirror the awakening Eleanor experienced. Each evening, as they gathered around their campfire, Daniel recording the day's discoveries in his journal, Matthew's eyes would find hers across the flames, filled with a future she was finally brave enough to imagine. Upon their return, Eleanor noticed a subtle shift in how townspeople regarded her. Mrs. Donovan no longer spoke to her with careful pity, but with genuine interest in her Yellowstone adventures. Children who had once stared openly at her scars now approached her with questions about geysers and bears, seeing her as someone with exciting knowledge rather than a curiosity herself. Winter descended on Willow Creek with its usual severity, but Eleanor found herself no longer dreading the isolation it typically brought. Between Daniel's lessons, Matthew's frequent visits, and her new role helping design additional wheelchairs for others with mobility challenges, her days overflowed with purpose and connection. On Christmas Eve, 6 months after their first meeting, Matthew and Daniel arrived at her cottage with mysterious smiles and a small wrapped package. Inside, Eleanor found a delicate silver pendant shaped like a mountain lion. "Daniel's idea," Matthew explained as she examined it with wondering fingers. "So you always remember how strong you are," Daniel added earnestly. That evening, as they shared a simple meal in her cottage, Eleanor felt a sense of completion she had thought forever lost to her. When Daniel eventually dozed by the fire, Matthew took her hands in his. "I have one more gift," he said quietly, "one that comes with a question." The ring he offered was simple, a band of silver holding a small, perfect pearl. "Unique and luminous," he said, "like you." Tears blurred Eleanor's vision as he continued. "I promised I wouldn't rush you, and if you need more time, I'll wait. But I love you, Eleanor Reed. Will you marry me?" She didn't hesitate. "Yes." As spring returned to Montana, Eleanor stood before her mirror on her wedding day. The woman who looked back bore little resemblance to the one who had hidden from life for 2 years. Her scars remained, 3 distinct lines across her cheek, but they no longer defined her. Touching them lightly, she remembered Matthew's words that autumn night. "They tell me how strong you are." Strength, she had learned, came in many forms. Surviving a mountain lion's attack, certainly, but also opening herself to love again, allowing herself to be truly seen, building a family from broken pieces. When she walked toward Matthew and Daniel waiting for her beneath a canopy of fresh blossoms, Eleanor moved with the confidence of a woman who understood at last that her scars were not the end of her story, but merely the beginning of her most beautiful chapter.